But I'd like to start by giving a very big welcome to everyone. Great to see you all. I'd like to acknowledge that we're the traditional owners of country across Australia. I'm on Gadigal land today, and I'd like to recognise the Indigenous people, their ongoing connections to lands, waters and culture on whatever land we're on today, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. And we're delighted that tonight's monthly session is being held in conjunction with Climate Action Week in Sydney, and we welcome all of you who are joining for the first time tonight. For those of you who are new, these are monthly online sessions, and we host a wide range of speakers, and you're very welcome if you'd like to receive the summary notes from tonight and or the recording or invitations to our future sessions. You can join via our website, and I'll share the link in the chat during the session and afterwards as well. And just a quick note as well, many of you attended the Nature Conservation Council's business breakfast at the end of February, which was terrific to see so many of our group there. We heard the Honourable Chris Bowen MP, who's the Federal Minister for Climate and Energy, and the Honourable Matt Keane, the Chair for the Climate Change Authority. And the session was moderated by Joe Taranto, who's a presenter and sustainability speaker. I thought I'd just quickly mention for those who couldn't make it, the topic was creating a climate of opportunity, what's next for business and the transition. And some of the key takeouts for me were that Australia really has a strong competitive advantage with our renewables in the areas of solar, wind and critical minerals. So we're really well positioned. Collaboration accelerates the transition. Community consultation is absolutely vital to ensure that communities are involved and supported through the transition and that everyone's brought along. Misinformation needs to be continually countered, particularly in the AI environment that we find ourselves in now. Another thing that really stood out to me was the poor state of our coal-fired stations. I was really surprised when Chris Bowen said at least one coal-fired station breaks down every single day, and that they're at the end of their life. So the sooner we transition to cleaner energy, the better. And if we succeed in the energy transition, yet we trash our environment, all our efforts will be pointless. So, but on to tonight. We've got a great session tonight entitled How Heat is Impacting Human Health. And we're delighted to welcome our speaker, Professor Ollie J. Ollie is a co-author of the recently released Lancet Countdown report, which outlines the latest science on heat and human health and recommends priorities to enable a healthy, thriving future. Ollie is a professor of heat and health and director of the Heat and Health Research Centre and Thermal Ergonomics Laboratory in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Sydney. He's been involved in the development of many initiatives, including the Heat Watch app and the Heat Measure, which has been used recently at the Australian Tennis Open. The Lancet is one of the world's most respected medical journals. The 2025 Lancet Countdown brings together the work of 128 expert researchers from 71 institutes. And it's an international collaboration that reports on a range of indicators from heat-related deaths to bank lending to fossil fuels. And it provides a comprehensive assessment of the links between climate change and health. So Ollie is going to take us through some of the key findings of the report and also cover some of the other highlights of his work. So Ollie, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. Can I just confirm you can hear me okay and you can see my slides? I'll just pop them into slide show, so continue share. Hopefully that's okay.
Yes, that's great, Ollie. We can hear you and see the slides.
Fabulous. Okay, I'll take it away then. So thanks so much for that introduction, Carolyn, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group today. As Carolyn mentioned, I'm academic director of the Heat and Health Research Centre. We're based in the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. And we've been going as a centre at the University of Sydney since mid-2022. And we're a growing organisation going through a period of significant capacity building over the coming months. So lots of work that I'd like to share with you in this space. I've been asked to speak about the way in which heat impacts human health, and that really kind of focuses on the problem. And of course, it's really important that we understand the nature of the problem so we can develop solutions. So I'm basically going to split my presentation today into two parts. The first part is talking about the doom and gloom, about how terrible everything is. But then I also want to kind of have a bit of hope. So really talk about the work that we're doing in the Heat and Health Research Centre, developing solutions, which really focuses on the way in which things are happening in different ways across the human lifespan. Throughout the presentation, I'll also kind of bring in some aspects of the Lancet Countdown report, which Carolyn also mentioned, just very briefly to give you an idea of what my role in that is. I've been a co-author on the global report, which is published annually in the Lancet since 2022, and then as of 2024, I took over as chair of the Working Group 1, and Working Group 1 focuses on health impacts, hazards, and vulnerability. So I'm very familiar with that, and there's 5 working groups that work across the Lancet Countdown initiative. The Lancet Countdown is our executive director is Marina Romanello. She's based at UCL in London. And the chair of our board is the Right Honourable Helen Clark, who's obviously the former Prime Minister of New Zealand. So I'll get into describing the problem to start off with. Now, undoubtedly, there's no one on this call that needs walking through this particular slide hand in hand. We've all seen it. I like to use this example because it has lots of different ways of demonstrating the same thing. And so lots of different independent measures of the way in which mean global temperature, which is on the y-axis, has changed since the mid of the 19th century relative to present day. And the reason I like to have those multiple measures, those independent measures, it shows that there's a repeatability of the signal. And so this really kind of solidifies what the problem obviously is. I used to show this, a different version of this graph up until about 2022, when we need to change the y-axis, because the change is becoming so much greater than it was before. I like to use a few contextual kind of signposts in this. So I'm 51 years old. I was born in 1975. And from the mid 19th century to when I was born, we had about I don't know what we got there, about a 0.2 degrees Celsius increase in mean global temperatures. I'm also the proud father of a 5-year-old. She was born on Anzac Day in 2020. And the average global temperatures have increased more since she was born. So the last 6 years almost than they did from the mid 19th century to when I was born in 1975. So that kind of really gives us an idea of the trajectory that we're on. There's lots of different ways in which we can talk about it, but I'm sure I don't need to convince anybody that we're on this call that we're living in an era of global warming. Now, the problem generally is that, of course, if we look at it from an ecosystem perspective, of course, there's lots of different aspects of global warming that are problematic, particularly to human health. But if we think about heat, the problem with heat is not the average temperatures rising that are generally the problem, it's the extremes. And so we'll see headlines like these across different media outlets throughout the world where extreme heat events or heat waves strike different places around the world and have a devastating impact on human health and well-being. Now, Carolyn mentioned in the introduction that I'm involved in the Lancet Countdown, and as I mentioned, I chair the Working Group 1, which looks at hazards. We have an indicator, which is, for those of you who are familiar with the Countdown report, is indicator 1.1.5. The important thing is it looks at heat-related mortality. And in the latest heat-related mortality indicator showed that annually, we experience around about over 500,000 deaths per year due to extreme heat. In the last report, it was actually 546,000 deaths due to extreme heat. Every single one of them is preventable. Again, context always helps try to understand what these numbers mean. We're rapidly approaching the number of people that die annually from malaria. Now, it's of course not a competition, but I think everybody will accept malaria is still a significant public health problem. And so heat, which is one aspect of the climate change problem, is clearly a really public health threat. In terms of its trajectory, what we see, again, from the Lancet Countdown report showed that, in fact, this number has increased by 60% since the 1990s, if we look at that as a baseline. A lot of people then come back and say, well, you know, the global population has increased a lot since the 1990s. So is this just an inflationary aspect of the population? Now, even if it was just that, I would argue that's still not a reason for us not to be concerned. But in fact, this number has gone up by 23%, even after you account for the expansion in the global population since the 1990s. So clearly a very big problem that we need to contend with. Again, if you want a soundbite to try to get this statistic across, it's the equivalent of one death due to extreme heat every minute of every day throughout the year. So that's really quite a significant health impact, of course. Now, what are people dying of? People think that, it's probably people dying of heat stroke. But in fact, it might surprise you to understand that, or to learn that if we look at the hospital records, look at why people die or why people get hospitalized, actually heat stroke, which is a critical rise in body temperature, which results in denaturing of proteins, but also causes this systemic inflammatory response syndrome, is actually responsible for about a quarter of heat-related deaths or hospitalizations. What we see is a huge signal in the cardiovascular disease population and also in the kidney disease population. And these are through different mechanisms, the way in which extreme heat impacts the human body. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time going through these mechanisms because we're probably not all that interested in that, even though I'd be happy to answer any questions about this after the slides are done. But I really just demonstrate this to show that the way in which extreme heat impacts human health is different and multifaceted. And therefore, the problem is varied and the solutions must therefore be varied as well. I like to think of the way in which extreme heat impacts human health as an iceberg. Probably pretty poor analogy given that icebergs are cold, but I'm sure you'll catch my drift. So just in terms of trying to capture what is actually happening at the population level. Now, we talk a lot about heat-related deaths, and of course that's the ultimate health impact. And it's something that, well, at least in Australia, can be counted relatively accurately by our health system, even though there's lots of arguments suggesting that there's a big underestimation of heat-related deaths. But below that's the tip of the iceberg, which we can see, which we can capture by our health system. And below that, we've got our hospitalizations, which we see, which are, think about the impact to our health system, probably cost on average about 10 times more than the average mortality case, a morbidity case, depending on how long they're hospitalized for. Again, we can capture that with our health system data. But below the surface of the water, the main mass of the iceberg, are all these other health-related impacts that may not be fatal, they may not result in people ending up in hospital, but they still have profound impacts in the way in which people cope with extreme heat and hot weather in different ways across the human lifespan. So I'll try to describe some of that right now. So what we know is that, for example, during pregnancy, women who are exposed to extreme heat during specific stages of their pregnancy, they still not fully understand exactly when is the most perilous window. But we know that extreme heat exposure during pregnancy increases the risk of stillbirth, increases the risk of preterm birth by about 45%, which can have a significant downstream impact on health and well-being across the lifespan. We know during early childhood, it's very difficult to maintain body temperature of babies when they're going around in prams. This is particularly a problem in the developing world where exposure is amplified by a lack of shade and a lack of infrastructure. Even here at home, we know that extreme heat during physical activity in youth sport increases the risk of exertional heat illness in kids. We know that educational outcomes in hot schools are impaired and have significant lifelong impacts. It's difficult for teachers who are overheated themselves teaching in hot schools to get the right educational outcomes themselves. As we enter adulthood, we know that extreme heat and hot weather costs the Australian economy more than $6 billion a year, with a B, $6 billion a year in lost productivity. That's an annual number. If we look at that globally, by the year 2030, extreme heat is forecasted to cost the global economy more than $2.4 trillion a year in lost productivity. And I think that's approximately equal to around about 1 to 1.5% of global GDP. So if you think about projection rates, that's a big chunk of productivity which is impaired due to extreme heat. When extreme heat impacts sports, both in the professional level and also at the recreational level. And we know that it also impacts different occupational settings as well, particularly those that take place outdoors. Once we get into older age, age-related decrements in the ability to sweat, increased risk of other chronic diseases really results in a much greater and amplified impact of extreme heat on people above the age of 75. These are complicated further by other chronic diseases that implicate the cardiovascular system, the neural system, or the renal system and cardiorespiratory system. So these, and I could talk about this for a long time, but that really summarizes the way in which extreme heat and hot weather can impact people in different ways across the human lifespan. Now, when we're thinking about solutions, we really need to think in a systems-wide way. This is not just a matter of giving everybody access to air conditioning, on account of the fact that even if we could, in an ideal world, give everybody access to air conditioning, we just simply don't have the energy infrastructure to be able to deliver that much electricity to everybody at the same time when everybody's turning on the AC units. There's a significant consideration called cooling poverty, where people own air conditioners, but they're afford of the cost of the bills, so they therefore don't use it during hot weather, often to the detriment of their health. So we need to think about smart and accessible and sustainable ways in which we can keep people cool despite the hot weather moving forward into the future. We need to think about the way in which extreme heat interacts with other features of the environment. Back in the summer of 2019 and 2020, we'll all remember the terrible bushfires, and there's been intermittent bushfires again this summer. So looking at the way in which poor air quality interacts with extreme heat and exacerbates risk of cardiovascular disease-related hospitalization, for example, is an area of intense scrutiny at the moment. We're also doing some work looking at the limits of human survivability due to extreme heat and humidity. There are going to be regions of the world in a not too distant future that are going to be too hot or too humid to be able to enable people to survive a sufficient amount of time. So this is going to result in potentially changes to patterns of human migration, competition for resources, and are often potentially serving as a catalyst for conflict. We're also looking at ways in which extreme heat interacts with the risk of other communicable diseases. So, for example, what we know in areas of the world that still have malaria is that the number one way in which we try to prevent malaria is people having insecticide-treated bed nets to prevent mosquito bites. But the number one barrier to overnight net use compliance is feeling too hot. Likewise, another aspect that is exacerbated by extreme heat is the risk of waterborne diseases, because the number one recommendation that people are given during hot weather is to drink more water. But if you live in a setting where there's limited drinkable water available, there's an increased risk of waterborne diseases. So we're working on some solutions related to that. So if anybody has any questions that would like to discuss related to those things, I'll be happy to field that at the end of the presentation as well. So as I mentioned, I direct the Heat and Health Research Centre, which was established in 2022. We're working on a variety of different things, and we organise ourselves according to 5 priority research themes: maternal and child health, physical activity, sport and occupational health, aging and chronic diseases, landscapes in the built environment, and humanitarian settings. And below each of those research themes, you'll note that there is a few example dot points of projects that are currently underway, led by our researchers. So by the middle of this year, we'll have about 30 full-time researchers working in our centre who are all dedicated to trying to find solutions to these problems. This is a great opportunity for cultivating the next leaders in heat and health research as well, because we have appointed an early or mid-career researcher to lead each of these priority research teams, and they're supported by a senior mentor and overseen by myself and Felicity Bright, who is our centre manager. So before I go any further, I just want to spend a bit of time explaining the way in which extreme heat translates into the problem at the individual level. Extreme heat is typically characterized by temperature, but most people don't realize that temperature is actually measured in the shade. Humidity really matters, because the way in which we try to defend body temperature is by sweating. That sweat has to evaporate, but the driving force for that sweat evaporation is dependent on the amount of moisture in the air. So the humidity really matters. We'll all be familiar with that sweet relief of a breeze on a warm, muggy day. That's because air velocity, so wind speed, also makes a difference to how hot you get. Air velocity doesn't make the air cooler, but it makes the air better able to cool you by promoting sweat evaporation. for example. So we need to characterize the hazard, not just using temperature, which is measured in the shade, but using these 4 environmental parameters: temperature, humidity, radiation, and velocity. And it depends how exposed you are. It depends what you're doing and what you're wearing, whether you live in an urban area where features of the landscape amplify heat exposure. And together, these factors determine the level of heat strain that the human body experiences, how hot we get, how much work our heart has to do to try to help us keep cool, and how dehydrated we become. And then this translates into a health risk. And so the level of health risk for a given level of heat strain is dependent on personal characteristics, such as one's age, your health status, whether you have a certain chronic disease or certain lifestyle factors as well. Then there is also opportunities for behavior to modify exposure and modify this heat strain, such as different ways in which we can encourage people to be hydrated, personal cooling strategies, changing the way in which our cities are built. And it could also modify the heat strain directly as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on and what things can be done across different levels of what we call the heat cascade to try to relieve this risk of heat strain translating into amplified health risk. So back in 2021, in a paper that we published in the Lancet, which is part of the Heat and Health series in the Lancet, we described something called the heat cascade. And this basically gives us an idea of opportunities to introduce interventions. We can do so, first of all, at the landscape or urban level. So this is thinking about the way in which our cities are built, our towns are built, thinking about integrating green infrastructure, these like parks and trees, thinking about integrating blue infrastructure such as waterways and lakes. And this will then moderate the level of heat retention at the landscape level, which can ultimately then translate into heat stress exposure at the individual level. At the next level of the heat cascade is the building level. So there are things we can do at the building level to modify how much of the heat that's outside gets to the person that's inside the building. We can think about ways in which we modify glazing or alter the insulation of our walls or the roofs. We can affect the way in which heat is conducted into the indoor environments or the way in which long-wave radiation can penetrate through the built environment. And then there are things that we could do at the individual level. So if all else fails, if you're still exposed to hot temperatures with high humidity, with low airflow, and other factors, you can modify heat transfer at the skin surface without having to not necessarily reduce air temperature, which is what the whole premise of air conditioning is. And the reason that we would do that is that ultimately what we're looking to do is alter or moderate that physiological strain that is ultimately responsible for people becoming sick or ill during extreme heat events. So this is how hot they get, how dehydrated they become, how much work their heart has to do, and how much strain their kidneys are under, and other systems. I'm just using those as a particular example. So what I'm going to do now is walk through some of the work that we've been doing, developing interventions at different levels of different types, targeting different groups of people, try to understand how we can build resilience at the community level to extreme heat in a warming climate. Now, this is not to say that adaptation should preclude efforts to mitigate climate change. I think we can all accept now that we're at a point in time whereby we don't have the luxury of just focusing on doing one. We must do both together. And importantly, we must focus on finding ways in which we can build resilience to extreme heat, think about ways in which we can keep people cool without contributing further to the problem through typically using air conditioning units, which then are often powered by fossil fuel power plants, which then belch out more CO2 into the air, which then warm the climate, which then increase the amount of cooling that we need. So that kind of keeps us locked inside this vicious cycle. So I direct a laboratory where we try to answer these questions and try to develop solutions. It's called the Thermal Ergonomics Laboratory, and it's based on the top level of the Susan Wakefield Health Building, which was opened in 2021 at the University of Sydney. We're on the Camperdown campus in central Sydney. In the Thermal Ergonomics Laboratory, it houses a climate chamber. And in this climate chamber, we can simulate any heat wave of the past. So what we do is that we go into the weather records, we extract the peak temperature and concurrent humidity of extreme heat events that have impact on human health and well-being in the past. We can recreate those different versions of the past and expose human participants under careful medical supervision to these conditions. And we can actually then measure what these conditions does to people's physiology. How hot does it make them? How dehydrated does it make them become? And how much work does their heart have to do to maintain safe body temperatures? We can then systematically test the way in which simple low resource cooling strategies reduce those markers of physiological strain. Then we work with public health organizations to try to translate that science into changes in public health action and public health policy. I'll describe some of the work that we've been doing in that vein shortly. Another aspect of this facility is that we've, in a sense, future-proofed it as well, to the extent that we also have the ability to simulate heat waves of the future. So we work with climate scientists to understand what the heat waves of the future are going to look like with different climate change scenarios based on our carbon emission pathways that we embark on in the future. One big challenge that we find, and this is shared by many people on this call, I'm sure, is trying to get people to understand the gravity of the decisions that we make now. And when we talk about the changes in mean global temperatures of 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, people have a really hard time in understanding what that means in terms of impacts on people. And so what we can do is work with climate scientists to understand what these peak heatwave conditions of these different futures will look like, and actually measure what they do to people right now before it's too late to make the right decision. And so this is another way in which we try to make the different futures come to life to help inform policy changes and judgment, and also calls for action. So based on the data that we collect in our laboratory, we were able to work with the Lancet to develop this schematic, this infographic, which helps people understand the evidence-based ways in which people can stay sustainably and accessibly cool during extreme heat events. Now, this is focusing on people who don't have access to air conditioning, or focusing on people who don't want to use air conditioning for a variety of different reasons. And often I show this schematic, this infographic, and people might look at it and think, oh, well, this all seems pretty straightforward. Do we need scientific evidence to support this? It's pretty obvious you should use fans in hot weather, for example. But if I draw your attention to the dot points below, actually, it's quite a nuanced message that we're trying to get across. What we actually found in our work is that electric fans are very helpful, but up to a certain point. But when fans are used above 40 to 42 degrees Celsius, in fact, what we found is that depending on people's age and depending on the humidity of the environment, they can actually accelerate body heating. They can actually make the problem worse without people realizing it. So trying to embed this type of information into public health messaging has been a real challenge for us over the past 5 or 6 years. It's also thinking about other ways in which we can use water. Often people think about drinking water, which of course is very advisable for maintaining hydration status, but not many people think about taking that water and placing it on their skin. If you do that, the only reason that we sweat in the first place is that we try to augment evaporative heat loss. But if you apply water to the skin surface, that water then evaporates, it reduces your necessity to sweat in the first place, and it also really keeps in check that cardiovascular strain as well. And there are other aspects that we've also investigated as well. And these are all freely accessible, and I'd be happy to share the links to this information after the call. We've also done some work in the occupational realm. So we received a grant from the Wellcome Trust in the UK to have a better understanding of what can be done at scale in the ready-made garment factory industry in Bangladesh. So the ready-made garment factory industry in Bangladesh is responsible for 84% of exports. So it's incredibly important to the Bangladeshi economy. It also employs over 4 million people as well. However, the types of conditions that these workers have to endure to make the clothing that many of us will be wearing right now are really quite striking. And so we work with the Wellcome Trust to better understand the level of conditions that they were exposed to, and then develop some solutions. So I'll briefly explain this study to you. We worked with a garment factory in Dhaka for a couple of years, where we kitted the whole factory out with 33 different temperature humidity sensors across the 3 floors of the factory, and measured the conditions that the workers were exposed to. And we found that during the first week of May, which is typically the warmest week of the year, people were exposed for over 10 hours at a time to temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius and 40% humidity, while also having to conduct their work. So those are the type of conditions they're exposed to. Then we work with the garment factory owners to understand what type of interventions they'd be willing to implement if we could demonstrate that they work in a proof of concept study. Well, and a really important aspect of this is that the cost had to be quite low, and it also had to be a very scalable solution. So testing the latest cooling vest, for example, was simply not a viable thing that we needed to test on account of the fact that they had 780 workers in the factory at once, and trying to kit them all out with these types of garments would have been absolutely impossible, and they only work for a certain amount of time as well. So the amount of maintenance that would be necessary would just be completely infeasible. So we didn't look at solutions like that. We looked at ways in which you can move air, ways in which we can provide hydration regimens for workers without impairing their ability to work, and also things that you could do to the factory roof. So if you implemented a green roof or a reflected white roof, how much of a difference would that make to the internal conditions? If you coupled that with another intervention, would it reduce how hot the workers get, how uncomfortable they are, and would it still maintain their productivity so that everybody is benefiting from the situation? So that's an example of a study that we did where we basically simulated a Bangladesh ready-made garment factory in our chamber at the University of Sydney and systematically worked through these different interventions with different garment workers as our participants. A completely different type of study that we've done is looking at the question of what you should do to keep your baby cool in a stroller on a hot day. And this is one of the most popular studies we've ever published, frankly, even though it's a pretty straightforward one. And so what we wanted to do is understand, this is actually when I became a father, I was quite interested as to whether we should be using a white muslin cloth to cover the baby's pram, because you see a lot of people doing that. What we found is that if people actually do that, it increases the temperature inside the pram by about 4 degrees Celsius. But if you take that cloth, you wet it, then you then place it over the pram, and you place a little baby fan inside of the stroller at the same time, it reduces the temperature inside the pram relative to outside the pram by 5 degrees Celsius. So that's almost a 9 degrees Celsius difference between the way in which people typically do things right now and the way in which they could do it using pretty much the same resources that are available. And so this got a lot of interest in the popular press, and we also work with the World Health Organization to translate this information into changes in public health policy. So I'll just finish off just talking about a couple of other things from the translatory space. So, we conduct our research. We obviously love to publish them in nice, impactful journals, but if that's where we stop, we're not doing our job. What's really important is that we focus on not just doing the research, but translating the findings of our research to changes in policy, practice, and action. And so to that end, we work with public health organizations to try to embed the work that we and our colleagues are conducting into the messaging that we're putting out to the general public. So globally, we work with the World Health Organization, and domestically, we work with a lot of the health ministries and other organizations in medicine and health in Australia. We also struck up a really exciting collaboration with Google back in 2023. So they were planning the launch of their excess heat warning tool, which is embedded on every single Google Chrome app and Google Maps app worldwide. So we capture around about 4.5 billion people with this tool worldwide. And so Google have their excess heat warning, and they came to us to say, okay, well, we give the warning, but what should we be telling people to do? And so what we did is then modified our findings and made sure that we had really pithy messaging that people could understand in a very easy and short dose, based on the research that we've done in the Heat and Health Research Center. And so in terms of trying to understand how many people are interacting with that warning, this is probably the best way we can do it. So you can compare the amount of people that interact with that. So the excess heat warning is a push alert that you get on Chrome or on your Maps app, and you press it, and that's counted as a query. And you can compare the number of those queries for the excess heat warning. So this is people looking at the safety tips that we're giving them, and compare them to all the other search queries that are entered across Google globally that year. And in 2024, which is the first year in which we did this, we had our excess heat warning was the second most queried term globally. The only thing that got more queries than excess heat warning was the 2024 US election. We had more queries, but for our warning the Olympics in 2024 and the search term Trump shot as well, which shows there's a high level of interest in what we were doing. We've also developed our own heat warning system, which really places physiology at the center of things. This is called Heat Watch. It's free, easy to use, enables people to create a personal heat rating. So you create a personal profile. It uses a physiological model to integrate things like your age, whether you're on medication, whether you have a chronic disease, to get your own personalized heat warning. We also give you a 7-day forecast based on this, and you can create up to 3 different profiles at once. This was co-designed with the community. This is a web tool right now, and we have a funding application under review with the National Health and Medical Research Council right now to develop this further with different communities in Australia and conduct a randomized trial to actually measure the impact of having this tool relative to other sources of information that are available. And I'll just finish off with a one study that we published in 2022, which I think is really nice because it gives everybody a tip that they can take home from this presentation that pretty much everybody can use if you have air conditioning and you're wishing to reduce the amount of air conditioning that you're using during the summer, but without compromising your thermal comfort or your health. So this was a paper that we published that looked at this idea that we pioneered for the last 3 or 4 years called fan first cooling. So I'll quickly describe this to you. So if we think about on this graph, this is just a theoretical illustration of the way in which temperature, ambient temperature in a house changes throughout the day on a hot day. The sun will come up, temperature will go up, it will stay high throughout the day, and then it'll come down at the end of the day. And the way in which we respond to the heat is that our skin can tolerate certain increases in temperature until we exceed a threshold, a temperature threshold. And it's around about 22 degrees Celsius air temperature, which makes us feel uncomfortably hot. And for most people, this is the trigger to actually turn their air conditioning on because we want to use it to relieve thermal discomfort. So when air temperature, internal temperature goes above this thermal comfort threshold, you'll turn your air conditioning on and it'll be running for quite a few hours and it'll be working quite hard to maintain the indoor temperature at that temperature that keeps you comfortable. And that will use a lot of energy and electricity and it will be quite expensive. Now, if you introduce a fan and you're blowing air across the skin, it makes that air cool you more efficiently. And basically what it means is that that air will feel cooler than it actually is. So in turn, what it means is that you can tolerate higher indoor temperatures while still maintaining thermal comfort. And so what this means is that you can set your air conditioner to start cooling at a much higher temperature than you otherwise would because you're keeping the body cool by blowing air across the skin. And so what we've done laboratory testing, we demonstrate that instead of setting your air conditioner to 22 degrees Celsius, you can increase that set point on your air conditioning unit to turn on to cool at, let's say, 26 or 27 degrees Celsius. It doesn't warm it up to that, of course. It's just passively warming up and then it starts cooling to maintain that temperature. And then you'll feel just as comfortable. But then the air conditioning unit will be turning on later in the day. It'll be turning off earlier in the day. It won't be working as hard throughout the day. And we were curious to say, if everybody in Australia adopted this fan-first cooling strategy, how much electricity would they save on their electricity bills? And what we found is that it will reduce your electricity bill by about 70 to 75% for cooling throughout the summer. So think about that. So the number one line item on most people's electricity bill in the summer, unless you have solar, of course, is your air conditioning use bill. And we can reduce that by 70 to 75% by adopting this fan-first cooling strategy. The last thing we did is said, okay, well, how does that change greenhouse gas emissions? And so some people may be familiar with this. This is the greenhouse gas abatement cost analysis. So very simply, I didn't understand this before we did it. This is why we do multidisciplinary research, so you can collaborate with people who do understand this kind of thing. But from a basics perspective, on the y-axis, we've basically got how much greenhouse gas reduction you can achieve, and then it's relative to the cost of it. And so the ratio between is the cost-benefit analysis. And the best thing we've been able to do to date is when everybody switched from incandescent lighting to LED lighting, that gave us a pretty good bang for our buck in terms of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions for the cost of the intervention. This fan-first cooling strategy was found to be superior to even that. This hasn't been adopted as a change of policy yet. We're really looking for policy entry points to try to scale up this this intervention. It's a very promising one because it's such a scalable strategy that pretty much anybody with air conditioning can use to slash the costs of their electricity bill, plus reduce the amount of electricity that we're using during the summer. So I will finish off there. If anybody's interested in the work we do, there's a QR code there. We worked with the BBC back in 2023 to create a very short film. It's about 5 or 6 minutes. It's really available to anybody, and you can view it if you just scan that QR code there. But I'll finish up there and hand it back to Carolyn to see if there's any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ollie. You covered a lot in a very short space, or relatively short space of time. So many interesting things to ask you about. We've got one question. Stephen and I have got some questions, but Melody's asked, wondering during studies focusing on biologically female health scenarios and potentially interventions, are menstrual cycles considered in the outcomes as base body temperature changes through the course of a menstrual cycle? Is it possible to include consideration of hormone-related body temperature shifts in research outcomes?
So a lot of work that...
Sorry, Matilda.
A lot of the work that we do is, all the work that we do focuses on both men and women to an equal degree, except when we're looking at things like pregnancy, of course. Menstrual cycle is a consideration when we are doing our studies. Traditionally, the way it's done is that you would try to, just from a methodological perspective, you say, okay, well, I want to kind of moderate the effect of menstrual cycle on our outcome measure. So you'd always test the female participants during their follicular phase or during a fixed part of their phase, because then you don't have the confounding effect of the menstrual cycle on body temperature. Because then we realize is that in real life, you're not doing that. So what we do is we track what stage of the menstrual cycle, or whether participants are on oral contraceptives. These are for younger participants, of course, and then we use that as a covariate in our analysis. In terms of biological sex-related effects, the main thing is actually it's kind of like a morphological thing, actually. So what we see is submaximal sweating responses of females and males are pretty much exactly the same, depending on the conditions. But what we found is that the maximum sweat rate, so the maximum amount of sweat secretion for women, is a little lower than it is in men, even if we normalize for how much surface area they have. This is because of the size of the sweat glands. So male sweat glands generally tend to be bigger, and therefore they can output more sweat per gland, and therefore the upper sweat rate is higher in men than women. But that's an example of sex-related or biological sex-related impacts.
Thanks, Ollie. There's a lot to it. Melody's asked a question about your fan air conditioning research. What policy levers would you need to unlock specifically? For example, would it be mandated building standards for new builds, or more accommodation for the public?
It worked.
So it depends. So I think probably both of those. So I think mandating it in new builds would be a great way of ensuring that we're set up for using this intervention in the future. But one of the things I'm really excited about with this particular strategy and intervention is that it's something that can be implemented right now. And it can be done so relatively easily. So a lot of people think about ceiling fans, which are typically installed. You can get a ceiling fan installed in a place relatively easily, but you can also do this with the pedestal fan as well. So I think it's really thinking about the way in which we can socialize the potential impact of this intervention at scale to people and in a way in which they fully can understand it and implement it. one of the things we've also been thinking of is working with energy companies as well. So initially, you might think, well, why would the energy company want to incentivize people to use less energy because they're selling less of it? But this becomes an incentive during extreme heat events because of concerns about the demand on the grid. And so this fan first cooling strategy also shaves off the peak demand as well quite significantly. So it could be a good opportunity for intervention there. So we can look at it from a variety of different ways. We can look at it from an energy use perspective, so thinking about managing energy supply. We can think about it from an equity perspective, so trying to increase the accessibility to cooling for people who can't afford air conditioning the way in which they're using it at the moment. And or we can think about it from an environmental perspective as well, so thinking about the way in which we can break that vicious cycle whereby we're using lots of air conditioning and then it ultimately results in more air conditioning demand.
Thanks, Ollie. I was actually thinking about, we've got lots of questions coming in, but I was thinking about when you were talking about, more generally, when you were talking about translating the findings to policy and public health outcomes, what you've found are the most effective, what have you had the biggest wins with in actually getting this really strong evidence into practical changes?
Yeah. It's probably it's been a lot of kind of lobbying, to be honest, and a lot of relationship building. That's really been kind of the key, I think. For example, the way in which the WHO learned of our work is that I became involved in a group which is co-convened by the WMO, so the World Meteorological Organization, and the World Health Organization, called the Global Heat and Health Information Network. And so it was through that I then had a platform to be able to then socialize this work, and also some of the spin out assets that we've had from some of the papers that we've published, these high profile papers. That's also kind of got it on their desk as well. I just noticed that Melody's asked for my email, so Melody, I'll just pop it in the chat now, and just so you have it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll keep going because there's some really great questions in the chat. Miriam's asked, she's interested to know what will be your areas of focus for studying the health impacts in the future using climate projections.
Yeah, using climate projections. So you mean future study? So do you mean future studies, or do you mean with the work that we're doing with projections? Maybe the projections. I'll go with that. Okay. So one of the things that we're really kind of interested in with the projections work is trying to get people to understand in a different way what the impacts of these different versions of the future are going to be. And so often you hear about people saying, oh, if only we knew, we would have made a different decision. And so there's such a problem with the climate crisis is that people find it really difficult to conceptualize what these different versions of the future will actually mean, not necessarily for them, but people like them. And so this is why we're kind of doing it in a way which is a little different. One of the things that we have also, we're starting to work on slowly, and we're looking for some kind of external interest in this as well, is I'll tell it with a very, very quick story. So quick story is that I went to Japan in 2019 to watch the Rugby World Cup. And there was a game in Kobe, and I got there quite early and I had some time to kill. And so I went to the Earthquake Museum in Kobe, and it was very, very striking. And helped me understand exactly, the devastation. But at the end, I kind of looked at the statistics of, obviously, again, it's not a competition, but I look at the number of people that were hurt or killed because of the earthquake, and it really pales in comparison to the impacts of heat waves. But people can't really conceptualize what heat waves do to people because it's called the silent killer. People die in their homes alone. It's not a visually dramatic event. A hot day will look like just a regular day. And so thinking about ways in which we can leverage other ways in which people can think and feel the impacts. So this is where we came up with this idea of a heatwave museum, where we use different media. It could be art, it could be music, it could be all sorts of different things to try to get people to get a sense of what heat can do to people. and then try to use that as an opportunity to get people to take this more seriously and call for change. But then also at the other back end of this heatwave museum, what we'll have is all the different things you can do now to reduce vulnerability and reduce the impacts in the future. So that's kind of I went a bit off piece with that answer, Carolyn, but that's kind of one of the things that we're thinking of doing with this work if we can get the right people involved.
That's very innovative. It's great bringing all the different strands together. Ellie's asked a question about people with neurodiversity, and she's noted that she has quite a strong response and is very sensitive to temperature, and it's therefore impacting sometimes her ability to be out and about, and an inclusion issue. Have you done or seen any work about neurodiversity and heat tolerance or heat responses?
No, we haven't looked at that specifically, but what we do know is that there is a large level of inter-individual variability in these responses. And so what we try to do is actually better understand what different conditions, if you will, contribute to that variability. And so one of the ones I've talked about already is biological sex. That's an obvious one. Age is another one, different chronic diseases, different other conditions, medications, and things like this. So we are going through kind of all of those different aspects to try to understand individual variability. From just from a neural perspective, one of the things that we have worked on is with people with multiple sclerosis. So we know that people with MS have something called UTOS phenomenon, where where heat exposure temporarily worsens their MS-related symptoms, and so the underlying mechanisms are poorly understood. So we receive funding from MS Research Australia to better understand those mechanisms and develop evidence-based solutions as well. So that's an example of another different type of population group that we've been working with.
Thanks, Ollie. You're doing very well with a wide range of questions, so thank you for being so adaptable. I've got a technical one for you now from Mel, who's wondering about the emissions reduction on your marginal abatement cost curve. Does this take into account the embodied emissions associated with adding the fans? And Mel expects that the operational emission savings will be far more significant, but curious about the boundary of the analysis.
Yeah, so this is not my expertise. We work with sustainability experts to draw up this. But so yeah, what we did do is when we're giving the information to do this analysis, they wanted to know the overall analysis. They obviously needed to know how much power a fan would require, so we can integrate that into the analysis. And so if we look at so your typical air conditioner will use between 1,500 and 3,000 watts, depending on the type of air conditioner it is. And so a fan will use 10 watts, 50 watts. So there are some fans that use about 2 watts now. So you're talking at least a 24-fold lower energy requirement to operate the fan. Other factors that we took into account when we were doing the overall analysis for that study was even thinking about, okay, how many people are over the age of 67, I think it was, so therefore would be more likely to be home on a work day, weekends, public holidays, kids under the age of 5, so they'll be at home and not necessarily at school, and things like this. So we really tried to take into account as best we could all the different factors that would contribute to what the end result would be. So, and we tried to be as conservative as possible to make sure we're not artificially amplifying out a result. So the result that we ended up getting was actually probably the most conservative version of it, which again gives me a lot of hope for this really being a really promising intervention moving forward.
Thanks, Ollie. I'll move to Tilly's question now. Do you have any insights to how heat stress affects employee productivity in retail environments where they do have good aircon? Are there other considerations than just how hot they might feel inside with the air conditioning?
Yeah, that's a good one. So, so if you have air conditioning, you're obviously not exposed to the stimulus, and therefore the direct effects are not going to happen to you. If you think about people in an occupational setting, people obviously have to get to and from work. So heat exposure during that aspect of the day might have an effect, but obviously going to be a much lower effect than it would be in a setting where you don't if you don't have access to air conditioning. What we see is, particularly in manufacturing, large warehouses, they can't afford to air condition. They're just too massive. So heat exposure could be a real significant consideration there. Anybody who's outdoors, as I mentioned in my talk, is the temperature that's on the weather forecast is actually measured in the shade. So if you're in direct solar radiation, the levels of so something called black glow temperature that you're exposed to, which is 15 degrees Celsius higher than air temperature. And if you then couple that with physical activity, with clothing, that really adds to the heat strain that the person experiences. The number that I quoted in my slide when I was talking about the economic impacts of extreme heat and hot weather in an Australian context, that was from a study that was published by Kirsten Zander in 2016 in Nature Climate Change. And that $6 billion a year of lost productivity was mostly attributed to something called presenteeism rather than absenteeism. So often we think about people getting sick and therefore not being able to go to work because of the heat. That would be absenteeism, but it was mainly presenteeism. So this is people where they're at work, but they're just not as effective. And so what we know is that heat stress affects our ability to cognitively process things. So we make more mistakes. In the Bangladesh study that I mentioned, where we simulated the ready-made garment factory, we got people sewing and people doing ironing. Those are the two tasks that everybody that did in the factory itself. And we therefore could use it as a measure of productivity. And we found that we compared an air conditioning trial to the non-air conditioning trial. And so what we found is about a 15% reduction in productivity in the hot trial. And this is simply due to people slowing down and making more mistakes. And this is one of the things that you do. You naturally slow down because it's an autonomic protective action that you take to reduce your metabolic heat production and therefore try to keep yourself cool. So those are some of the ways in which heat can impact us in an occupational setting.
Thanks, Ollie. Jim's asked, do you have any comment on the Bureau of Meteorology's excess heat factor, which is now used to forecast heat wave severity in Australia? It's calculated across 3 days.
Yeah. So the excess heat factor from the Bureau of Meteorology, that forms the basis of their current heat wave warning system. It's very helpful if you think about it from the perspective of the way in which heat is going to impact everything. But it doesn't have a physiological model in the center of it. It's not based on the way in which human bodies work. And so John Nairn, who's the guy who developed it, fully acknowledges that. And so actually we're working with the Bureau of Meteorology right now on a pilot project where we're working with a guy called Mitch Black, who's one of their researchers. And so what we're looking at is saying, okay, if you look at heat waves of the past and you use the excess heat factor to characterize heat waves, what extreme heat events are we missing with that method, and are we capturing it with our heat watch algorithm? And so what we're hoping to show is that in the long term is that a tool like Heatwatch, which is more responsive to single day events, would be more sensitive to those types of conditions, and that can sit alongside the excess heat factor, so that then you can have an integrated heat wave warning system potentially. So those are one of the things that we're working with the Bureau on to try to get a bit more human-centric approaches to it. But a short answer is the excess heat factor is good at capturing big heat wave weather systems that are approaching the country, and then giving people a big heads up to be able to prepare infrastructure, mobilize resources that are needed ahead of time. But it's not necessarily great for telling you exactly how it's going to affect you on a given day.
That sort of brings to mind the bushfire warning systems as well. I mean, do you try to link in with those? I suppose air quality.
So we have been talking about that on and off with various stakeholders. The trouble is that the people in those positions often change. So you have a really good conversation with someone and they move on to another job. But at one stage we were having a chat with some people in the government about, I think they were interested in developing an all hazards app at one stage, and maybe trying to integrate some of our work into that. But what's also quite interesting is the work that we're doing, looking at the interaction between bushfire smoke and extreme heat. So we've got Troy Cross, who's leading an NHMRC grant that's looking at that. And so the idea is that bushfire smoke won't worsen the heat stress on the body, but the the extreme heat might worsen the effect of the bushfire smoke on your respiratory system. Because as you get hotter, you breathe faster, and therefore the exchange of particles with your body, the probability of that goes up. So that's kind of our working hypothesis right now.
Interesting. Tilly just wanted to clarify when you were talking about the Bangladesh productivity study, did you say the difference?
15,
15.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
15.
And I missed a question earlier on from Melody. Melody was asking earlier about superhuman and aura rings, which millions of people wear to track body temperatures. And just wondering about data and insights, and I suppose other wearables.
Yeah,
Is anyone looking? Are you or anyone in the team looking at wearables or
yeah,
anything like
yeah,
that?
yeah. Very much so. I'm really glad you brought this up, Melody. Actually, so yeah, um, uh, so I'll just start off by telling you, it's been the holy grail for thermal physiologists for the last 50 years to come up with a reliable, non-invasive core temperature measure, and we haven't got there yet. So that probably hopefully gives you an idea of maybe the accuracy of those things. So what's interesting with the wearables kind of market now is that you've got all of these different sensors that they will purport to measure something, and they do measure something. And there seems to be a big thirst for data about yourself, which I'm into. I've got my step counter. I'm addicted to my step counter. But this is different to being able to develop a sensor that is sufficiently accurate for diagnosing things from a clinical perspective, or that is has the level of accuracy that you need for scientific experiments. So certainly for the body temperature data that comes from those types of devices, they're not very reliable at all. Um, there are other aspects. So we've been working with the Wellcome Trust. We've got a project that's happening in India and Bangladesh where we're doing a prospective cohort study with 5,000 pregnant women over the course of 5 years. And we're kitting our participants out with wearables. But the number of wearables that are, if you narrow down the wearables to ones that give you data that are sufficiently accurate to be able to answer a scientific or clinical question, it gets very small very quickly. And so there's still a long way to go in the wearables market from an accuracy perspective, but I don't think the forcing function is there from a development perspective for the manufacturers because they're doing a pretty good job of selling their devices as it is with the current level of accuracy that they have. So that answer is probably going to have to come from the scientific community rather than the companies that are in that area.
Interesting. Veronica's put a question. When you measured effectiveness of green roofs in providing cooling, what was the level of thermal comfort improvement?
Great question. Yeah, yeah. So this is the Bangladesh study. So just so full transparency on how we did it. So we didn't actually change the roof of the factory itself. What we did is that we took the materials of the building and then we used to enter it into a computer program called Energy Plus. And so this computer program reconstructs or constructs your factory. And then what it does, it enables you to say, okay, if I change the roof with this different type of property, how much of a difference does it, and you run it through a meteorological model, how much of a difference does it make to the internal conditions? And so what we found is that if you put a green roof or even a white insulated reflective roof, you basically get the same thing. You get about a 2.5 degrees Celsius reduction in internal temperature of the factory. The thing is, then the question was, well, is that enough, right? 2.5 degrees Celsius. It sounds a lot, but it depends what you're going from. If you're going from 50 to 48 and a half, or sorry, 50 to 47 and a half, it's probably not enough, right? But if in this particular case, you're going from 40 to 37.5. And so that alone had a modest impact on thermal comfort. I can pull out the link to the paper. It's open access, so you can take a look at the data in the paper yourself. But what we found is that if you then moved the air at the same time, that then amplified the effect of that lower temperature. So it made it more effective at improving thermal comfort and also reducing how hot physiologically these workers were becoming and how dehydrated they're becoming and everything. So I'll just before we finish, I'll pop the link of that paper in the chat so people have access to it.
Thanks, Ollie. I was just about to I'm just conscious of the time. We've got about 5 minutes left, and there's a couple more questions that have popped in. Look, if we don't get to the final questions, let's perhaps see if we can get an answer and share the answer afterwards. But we might, hopefully, we can get to Joshua's, Petra's, and Maria's before we finish. Joshua says, I'm an environmental and planning lawyer in Sydney, often review and consider basics and NAIDA's ratings. Is there active research ongoing to try to update these standards?
Yes, right. Yeah, so we have a landscapes and built environment theme in our centre. That's led by my colleague Federico Tartarini, who's based in the Faculty of Architecture, Planning and Design. So he would be the person who would be able to directly answer those questions. I don't have the technical knowledge to be able to respond with any authority on that particular question, I'm afraid, because that's very much in the built environment and land and architecture space.
Great question, though.
So sorry
about that later.
It's a good one. I can pass it on and try to get an answer for you.
Petra's asked, can you explain a bit more about the mechanisms behind how heat actually contributes to cardiovascular function?
Oh, yeah, sure, absolutely, yep. So, yeah, thank you. So the way this works is that, the way in which we respond physiologically to try to keep our bodies cool is that we do two primary things. We sweat, which everyone's familiar with. We also have this process called vasodilation. And this is basically where the blood vessels in our skin open up and we redirect blood from our body core, which is hot, towards the skin in an effort to try to keep cool. Now, we've only got so much blood inside our body. So if you think about fluid going through a series of pipes, and then all of a sudden you start directing or you open up those pipes to a wider diameter, what would happen is that because you only got so much blood in those pipes, if you didn't change anything, the pressure would go down. So your blood pressure would go down. So in order to defend that blood pressure, what you do is that you start having to circulate the fluid through that piping system at a faster rate. It keeps the blood pressure up, increasing something called cardiac output. Now, the cardiac output is the amount of blood that you circulate around the body every minute. That's made up of two things. You can change it by increasing the amount of blood that you pump with every contraction of the heart. That's something called stroke volume. We don't really do that in the heat because all the blood's sitting in the skin and the filling pressure of the heart actually goes down a little bit. So the only way in which you can do that is by increasing heart rate. And so I sometimes, when I give a more data-specific presentation, I'll show some data from a study that we did where we're measuring heart rate of a 84-year-old, otherwise healthy participants exposed to one of our simulated heat wave conditions in our lab. And you see the heart rate trace, and it goes up and up and up and up and up. And you look at it, and you think he's like running on a treadmill or something like this. And he's actually just sitting there in a very, very hot room. And all of the cardiovascular strain is generated by the fact that he's vasodilating and his heart is having to work harder to maintain blood pressure. And so in a healthy heart, that's less of a problem. But if you have a narrowing of the coronary arteries because of plaque buildup, for example, then the ability to meet the metabolic demand of these cardiac myocytes, because they're using up oxygen and you need to deliver that oxygen via the blood flow that goes through the coronary arteries, you get a hypoperfusion. You can't get enough blood to those cardiac myocytes to deliver enough oxygen. And so they're very metabolically active. Those myocytes are using up oxygen. And then when you don't have enough blood flow, you don't get enough oxygen, and then you start getting local ischemia. And so this is a reduction in oxygen delivery to those cells. And if it lasts long enough, you then get ischemic injury. And this is where your cardiac myocyte might die. And then that can then set off all sorts of problems, not least an electrophysiological problem, which might result in a fibrillation event or a massive heart attack. And so this is the underlying mechanism that we believe is responsible for the enormous amount of cardiovascular complications that we see and deaths during extreme heat events globally.
Ollie, thank you so much. In 30 seconds, is an extreme, as a last question from Maria,
sure.
Is extreme heat and extreme humidity events, are they the same, or should we have different responses to them?
Okay, so yes, so the different, well, okay, so it depends how you define an extreme heat event, and this is a problem with the excess heat factor. It only uses temperature. So integrating humidity is very, very important. the way in which we respond should be different. So, for example, I use fans as an example. Fans can be really detrimental in very hot, dry heat wave conditions because you're blowing hot air on the body. All your sweat evaporates anyway. You get no benefit from the fan, and you're adding heat to the system, and you overheat at a much faster rate. In slightly cooler but much more humid conditions, the problem is that your sweat can't evaporate, and that extra airflow helps that sweat evaporate. So that even though you're taking on extra heat, you get an extra heat loss from that sweat evaporation, and it ends up being beneficial. So that's a simple example of why whether it's humid or not really matters.
Amazing. Ollie, thank you so much. You can tell by all the questions how interested everybody
That's
is.
great. No, thank you very much.
Fantastic. I'm just going to hand over to Stephen to finish, say some final remarks.
Thanks, Carolyn. And yeah, a huge thank you, Ollie. That was a really fabulous session. And as Carolyn mentioned, so many great questions there as well, and delivered in a really, really engaging way. So thank you so much. I know you've got further things this evening, so really appreciate you taking this time. To everyone who's been on the call this evening, we hope you've enjoyed tonight's session. Thank you so much for all of you for attending, including our Climate Action Week guests. Great to have you join us as well. Looking forward, we've got some really fantastic sessions lined up over the coming months. So next month, in April, April the 13th, our guest that session will be Craig Wilkins. Craig is the National Co-Director of the Murray-Darling Conservation Alliance. As many of you know, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is currently under review. It's a highly contested area with many different interests competing. And the Murray-Darling Conservation Alliance is a coalition of 4 conservation councils who are advocating for better outcomes for nature and the environment for the river system in order to better ensure that the river system's long-term survival. So that's April. And then in May, we'll be joined by the CEOs of Relove and Thread Together. And both these organisations combine a focus on the circular economy with support, and they're supporting disadvantaged groups. So we've got a couple of great sessions there. So thanks again. It's been a great evening, and a particular thanks, Ollie, for a wonderful session. See you all soon.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.